They were marched into the courtyard before sunrise, when the sky was still the color of ash and the air carried that cold, metallic sting that made every breath feel like swallowing ice. The boots of 32 young women scraped against the gravel, slow, uncertain, synchronized only by fear. None of them spoke. None of them dared to. The guards didn't bark orders. They didn't have to. Silence walked beside them like another soldier. One of the women, Anna, just 21, felt her knees locking with each step. She stared straight ahead, but her eyes kept drifting to the walls closing around them, tall, brick, stained, execution walls. Her throat burned with a dryness that felt like choking. This is how it ends, her mind kept repeating, not as a thought but as a pounding verdict. She could hear her own pulse thrumming behind her ears. She tried to swallow, but her mouth was numb. They were lined up facing the wall. She saw the chipped bricks, the dark pockmarks that looked like bullet wounds carved into stone, and darker patches beneath them where rainwater and something else had soaked deep. Her fingers curled tight into her sleeves, knuckles white beneath the coarse wool of her uniform. She couldn't feel her hands, only the tremor running through them. A guard stepped past. She flinched. Her body braced for the command, aim, fire. Her stomach twisted so hard she thought she might collapse before they even shot her. Someone behind her let out a soft, broken sob. No one moved to comfort her. There was nothing left to say. The stories they had heard, of Allied troops humiliating prisoners, torturing them, killing them without a word, flashed through her mind like lightning. In training they were told capture meant the end of dignity, and capture by Americans meant the end of life. Anna believed it because belief was survival. There was never another version of reality presented to them. But now, in this final moment, facing a wall that looked like a grave standing upright, something didn't fit. Her blurred vision tried to focus again. There, painted into the stone, thin chalk lines. Another shape, not a pole for executions. Polished wooden post. A rectangle fixed to its top. A hoop. She blinked, confused. Breath stalled in her lungs. Why would a firing wall have a hoop attached to it? Another tremor slid through her. Not of fear this time, but disbelief. Her eyes darted left. Another hoop. 2 of them. Realization flickered like a candle against a storm. This wasn't a death yard. It was a basketball court. She stared at the wall, frozen, unable to speak, unable to process the collapse of everything she had braced her soul for. The rifles, the stains, the fear. None of it matched this new image worming its way past terror. If this wasn't an execution, then what was it? And why had they been brought here at all? Her heart didn't slow. Panic doesn't stop just because the blade doesn't fall. Instead, a new question rose larger than fear. If everything they were told about the enemy was wrong, then what else had been a lie? The wall didn't kill them, but it did something else, something much deeper. Cracked the first stone in a belief built since childhood. And once a crack forms, it only spreads. Before they ever stood in that courtyard, they were something far smaller than uniforms suggested. Not soldiers first, but daughters, shop assistants, schoolgirls, secretaries. The regime didn't start by giving them rifles. It started by giving them stories. Stories about enemies. Stories about fate. Stories about duty disguised as destiny. Anna had been 13 when she first saw a recruiting poster showing a smiling young blonde woman wearing the auxiliary armband, standing beside a soldier like a second flag. "Serve your people," the slogan said. Not fight, not kill. Serve. At the time, it sounded simple, almost noble. Most of the girls later standing beside her in U.S. custody had similar beginnings. They didn't sign up to storm trenches. They signed up to type orders, carry messages, translate radio chatter. The regime had a way of making civilian labor feel like a uniform sewn onto the soul. The war didn't reach them all at once. It seeped in, like cold water through floorboards, until suddenly they were inside it, ankle-deep and rising. Anna had once been a clerk at a paper shop. The smell of ink and dry parchment used to mean routine and quiet. Years later, it became the smell of orders, mobilization lists, casualty reports, requisition forms. typed by her fingers but carrying other people's lives inside their pages. She never saw a battlefield, but she watched names disappear into silence. Typed into silence. That was war too, just from a desk. And because she had never seen the world outside her country's walls, she believed what the state repeated. The enemy wants to erase you. The Americans are butchers. Capture means shame worse than death. These weren't rumors, they were curriculum. Indoctrination was not a scream. It was a lullaby. You don't resist a lullaby. You grow up inside it. The girls in that courtyard were not fanatics, not at first. They were gradually made into something obedient. And obedience is most dangerous when it feels like loyalty. When air raid sirens replaced church bells, most of them didn't question why. They questioned who to blame. Later, when surrender whispers spread through the ranks in the final months, propaganda doubled. Their officers began holding last morale briefings, not to inspire courage, but to weaponize fear. If we lose, one officer warned, they will make an example of you. The women will be the first to pay. There was no proof offered, but fear doesn't require evidence, just imagination. Some of the girls had seen Allied leaflets dropped by planes, but they were told even those were traps, psychological warfare, bait before execution. So when the shelling drew closer and German positions collapsed, surrender didn't feel like rescue. It felt like stepping toward a slow death you hadn't chosen. That's why, when they were captured, none of them cried from relief. They cried from dread. Anna remembered the moment of capture. Hands raised, breath shaking, praying not for mercy, but for swiftness. One guard had taken her wrist, checked for hidden blades or cyanide. Another ordered her forward. Nothing brutal happened, but nothing brutal happening was confusing when you had been promised brutality. Fear hates contradictions. The camp they were brought to didn't look like she imagined either. No bloodstained fences. No calles. Just order, and watchtowers, and strange foreign silence. She waited every hour for the mask to fall. It never did. So when soldiers marched them to the courtyard days later, she assumed this was simply the delayed moment. Punishment finally arriving. Terror doesn't vanish because time passes. It incubates. That courtyard morning didn't begin there. It began days, years earlier, in the small, invisible decisions that steered them toward that wall long before boots ever touched gravel. When they were taught patriotism without perspective. When they were told questioning was betrayal. When the world outside Germany was painted as a nightmare. The most effective captivity isn't made with chains. It's made with narratives. And even now, standing before a basketball hoop she mistook for a firing line, Anna wasn't free from those narratives, just cracked open by them. The indoctrination still tugged from inside. This must still be a trick. Mercy is camouflage. They're just delaying the spectacle. Her heart refused to trust what her eyes were struggling to accept. Behind her, another girl whispered, voice trembling, "Are they going to?" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Every woman in that line completed it in her own head. Are they going to kill us slowly instead? They had no categories for mercy, so kindness made less sense than cruelty. And that is why the story does not start in the courtyard at all. It starts in the years it took to convince them the courtyard must end in death. Because terror is not born in a moment. It is grown, planted early, watered often, and harvested only when the world collapses and the mind reaches for whatever myths were given to it. The wall didn't execute them, but everything they believed said it would. And belief, when cornered by truth, does not surrender quietly. Anna's legs still trembled long after she realized she wasn't staring at an execution wall. Fear doesn't vanish when danger dissolves. It lingers in the muscles, confused, unsure whether to unclench. Years of conditioning doesn't peel away just because a hoop is bolted to the bricks. Inside her chest, her pulse still beat like she was moments away from dying. The American soldiers didn't yell. They didn't strike anyone. They just stood there waiting, calm, bored even, as if this wasn't a stage for punishment at all, but a courtyard they had walked across a dozen times with no thought. That normalcy, that casualness was its own shock. She had been prepared for monsters. She had not been prepared for indifference. Behind her eyes, memory blurred into present. The officer shouting during final briefing, "If you surrender, you will not be treated as prisoners. You will be treated as less than animals." Now she watched an American soldier adjust his helmet strap and yawn. The contradiction scraped like sandpaper. Her fear was still telling her, this is the setup before the cruelty. Reality was whispering, what if there is no cruelty coming at all? But the human mind clings to the story that arrived first. She remembered another briefing, the one where they were told the Allies shot female auxiliaries on sight. No trial, no question, just a bullet for existing. The officer had stared them down as he said it, voice low, grave, certain. They will not consider you soldiers. They will consider you vermin. Yet here she was, alive, unstruck, unspat upon, unreduced. That was not mercy. In her indoctrinated mind, it was impossibility. The girls were told surrender would strip them of dignity. But it wasn't surrender that had done that, war itself had taken their dignity long before. Marching into this courtyard did not mark humiliation. It simply revealed how little they had ever understood of the world beyond the borders carved into their minds. Why then had she believed the lies so easily? Part of her wanted to say, because everyone around me did. But a quieter truth clung beneath it. Because fear is easier than uncertainty. Better to dread a monster than to admit you have never seen the enemy clearly. Monsters are simple. Unknowns are not. Her upbringing had not only told her what to think, it had told her what to fear thinking. And fear is a powerful censor. She glanced sideways at the young woman beside her, Marta, who was blinking hard, trying not to burst into tears again. Marta had been a farm girl before the war, the daughter of a dairy worker. She had once written in her pre-enlistment file that she hoped joining the auxiliary would make me useful, important. Nothing in that wish resembled cruelty or fanaticism. She wanted to matter, and someone had handed her a uniform as proof that she did. Did that make her innocent? Not entirely. Did it make her monstrous? Not at all. But war devours nuance first. It needs categories, not people. For years, they had been told the Allies were animals. Now they were seeing human beings. But that realization cuts both ways. If the enemy is human, then what were we? Another crack. The loudest things shaping a soul are often not shouted, they are assumed. Anna had assumed her side was righteous, and the other side was inhuman. But standing there beside a basketball hoop in the middle of an American camp, she felt the floor of certainty tilt beneath her. Children grow up learning what to fear. Adults spend war discovering what they were wrong to fear. The strange thing wasn't that she might live. It was that she didn't know what to believe without fear telling her. In that moment, she didn't feel like a prisoner of war. She felt like a prisoner of everything she had been taught. The wall had not killed her body, but it had begun dismantling the cage inside her mind. And cages don't fall in silence. They fall in ache, in doubt, in slow unraveling. The question was no longer, will we die here? The new question was far more frightening. What happens to a belief system when the enemy is kinder than the people who fed you fear? That question is the doorway this story walks through. Because before these women could face what mercy meant, they had to face what indoctrination had cost them. This is where their war truly began. Long before the courtyard moment, before capture, before surrender, the fear of Allied revenge was already living inside them. Not planted by rumor, but engineered by design. Indoctrination didn't just tell them who to hate, it told them what fate awaited them if they ever stopped hating. Fear wasn't a byproduct of Nazi propaganda. It was its currency. The Reich never just built armies. It built expectations. Grim futures whispered into young minds until terror felt like truth. And the closer Germany neared defeat, the darker those whispered futures became. Near the war's end, female auxiliaries like Anna and Marta were gathered into briefings that resembled confession halls. Their commanders didn't talk strategy anymore. Strategy was already bleeding out on every front. Instead, they delivered warnings. Final ones. Unchecked. Unverified. Brutal. You will envy the dead if you fall into Allied hands. Some of the warnings were theatrical. Spoken with icy gravity, dramatized for obedience. But others were quiet, delivered in the low voice of someone pretending to pity them. Those felt worse. A shouted threat can be dismissed as posturing. A whispered one feels like fate. The officers described Allied camps as slaughter yards. They said Americans collected trophies from prisoners, hair, clothing, jewelry, and displayed them like hunting kills. They claimed Allied doctors sterilized captured women. "You won't be executed quickly," one officer told them. "You will be erased slowly." The cruelty of these inventions wasn't only in their violence, it was in their plausibility. When you have never seen the world you fear feels like the only one that exists. Anna had never met an American. None of the girls had. And a human mind cannot imagine kindness where it has been taught to expect monsters. So the more implausible reality became, the more believable the lie remained. At night, in the barracks, the younger auxiliaries whispered about it, trying to sound brave. But the bravado cracked when lamps went dark. That was when imaginations turned carnivore. What if they make us watch before they kill us? What if they take turns? What if we disappear and no one even knows how? Fear is a puppeteer. It doesn't need proof, only audience. And indoctrination gave it front row seats. One evening, as rations ran thinner and artillery echoed closer, an older auxiliary named Irmgard had muttered a sentence that stuck like a thorn. "Better to die by a German bullet than live under a foreign one." It wasn't poetry. It was emotional lockdown. And most of them nodded, not because they agreed, but because it was easier than asking, what if none of this is true? Skepticism requires oxygen. Indoctrination suffocates it. Every day, Allied leaflets dropped from the sky. Messages about surrender, safety, humane treatment, printed in calm language. They fluttered through the air like handkerchiefs of hope. But their officers burned them in piles before any of the women could read them. "If the enemy must reassure you," one commander sneered, "that is proof they plan to betray you." Even kindness was turned into evidence of cruelty. The logic was airtight because fear welded it shut. By the final months of the war, the women weren't loyal anymore. They were psychologically trapped. They didn't stay in uniform because they believed victory was coming. They stayed because they believed hell waited outside it. And that is the cruelest part of indoctrination. It turns the rest of the world into a cage disguised as escape. So when capture finally came, when American troops surrounded their detachment and no bullets followed, it didn't feel like survival. It felt like a pause before the execution. They didn't think, "We are safe." They thought, "The killing hasn't started yet." Even the silence of Allied soldiers intimidated them, because silence in their imagination meant calculation. A predator choosing which wound to open first. That is why, in the courtyard days later, they felt terror coil through their nerves like barbed wire. They weren't reacting to that morning. They were reacting to years of manufactured nightmares. Propaganda didn't just prepare them to hate, prepared them to panic in advance. And the more humane the Americans behaved, the more terrified some of the women became, because kindness contradicted everything they had been taught, and a collapsing belief can be more frightening than a raised weapon. The soldier who yawned by the wall didn't know it, but he was shattering an entire worldview simply by being ordinary. Which raises a question far larger than one courtyard. What happens to a life built around fear when fear is proven false? For some of the women, the contradiction was confusing. For others, it was unbearable. When a belief system is built on fear, kindness doesn't feel like rescue. It feels like exposure. What do you cling to when the terror that shaped your identity begins dissolving in front of you? That unraveling began quietly. On their second day in custody, while being escorted to the mess area, Marta caught sight of two American soldiers sharing a cigarette and laughing. Not at them, not about them, just laughing. Free of hatred. Free of ideological edge. The sound startled her because she recognized it. It wasn't enemy laughter. It was human laughter. Farm laughter. Neighborhood laughter. The kind of laughter she hadn't realized she missed. She stared until her throat ached. How could the supposed monsters laugh like boys on a summer road instead of wolves? It shouldn't have mattered, but inside her chest, something loosened. Then something else tightened. A strange new panic began to flood in. Not fear of pain, but fear of being wrong. Being brutalized would have confirmed her worldview. Being treated humanly shattered it. Within days, the girls developed small mental fractures. One kept asking for a priest, though she hadn't prayed since childhood. One refused to drink water, convinced it was part of a softening tactic. Another tried to stay perfectly still, as if motion might provoke punishment. They were terrified not because of what was happening to them, but because of what wasn't. Anna noticed her own panic shift shape. She no longer feared the rifle. She feared the idea that she might have fought on the wrong side of the mirror all along. If they are not monsters, her thoughts whispered, then what did that make us? Guilt is heavier than terror because terror ends. Guilt remains. Even the smallest kindnesses rattled them. A soldier handing out canteens. A guard letting one woman sit when her legs shook. A medic who checked a sprained wrist gently, without judgment. The girls didn't know how to metabolize gentleness. No one had prepared them for mercy as a weapon against fear. The indoctrination they had swallowed so easily now burned like acid on the way back up. The Reich had trained them to imagine a world of enemies. The Allies confronted them with a world of people. That was more destabilizing than any cell or chain. But the breaking point, the moment when ideology began to truly crack, was not laughter or drinking water or medical care. It was language. On the afternoon before the courtyard incident, 2 guards passed the holding area carrying boxes of sports equipment. A basketball, gloves, rope for skipping drills. One of the auxiliaries whispered anxiously, "What are those for?" An American soldier overheard, paused, and answered plainly in accented German. "For playing. What else?" He shrugged. His answer was casual, unguarded, pure. "No venom. No gloating." Just normal life continuing. And that normalcy was more devastating to the Reich's illusion than any battlefield defeat. If the enemy lived like people, not beasts, if they played games and shared jokes and treated their prisoners like human beings, then the other side was not hell. Which meant, hell might have been home all along. Fear doesn't die cleanly. It dies coughing. So when the women were marched into that courtyard the next morning and saw the walls, they expected death, because terror was still their first language. But when they saw the hoops, that was the first moment reality overpowered indoctrination. The mind resists new truth until the evidence becomes unignorable. The hoop was unignorable. It was not an execution site. It was a recreation yard. That single contradiction carried more force than 1,000 Allied pamphlets. The Reich had spent years teaching them how to fear their enemies. But it had taught them nothing about how to recognize humanity when it stood right in front of them. Something profound was about to happen in that courtyard, not to their bodies but to their worldview. Because this was not going to be an execution. It was going to be a psychological unmaking. And unmaking is far more permanent than punishment. The moment the first American officer stepped forward to speak, the women were no longer terrified of death. They were terrified of awakening. The courtyard was quiet, but not the way execution grounds are quiet. It was the stillness of a place that had never hosted fear until fear was carried into it by the prisoners themselves. The brick walls stood tall and weathered, marked by time and sport, not violence. The ground was stamped not with blood, but with chalk smudges from yesterday's game. Yet none of the women knew that. Their eyes were still trained by dread. Anna's breathing came shallow and fast, the kind that doesn't feed the lungs, just keeps panic alive. She didn't trust what she saw. She couldn't, because her mind had already chosen a narrative long before her senses tried to correct it. One of the Americans stepped forward. He wasn't holding a rifle at ready, just carrying a clipboard. But when he moved, several of the women flinched as though they expected a blow. The psychological reflex ran deeper than they understood. Anticipate harm before it lands. The officer looked at them, and this was the moment that began to undo everything. He didn't look at them like vermin. He looked at them like people present for a bureaucratic process. That was all. Not hate, not hunger for vengeance, just procedure. He spoke English first, then repeated in patient German, slower, careful with pronunciation. You are being processed. You will be assigned quarters. There will be order and there will be rules. You will not be harmed. The words didn't land as reassurance. They landed as disorientation. Not harmed? The girls exchanged stunned glances. Not because they believed him, but because the sentence itself existed. The Reich had told them they would never hear such words. Marta whispered under her breath, her voice cracking. Why would they say that if they planned to? She couldn't finish. Because if the Americans didn't intend cruelty, then the officers who had warned them had lied. Anna's hands trembled harder. Her body wasn't built to accept gentle truths as easily as harsh ones. Brutality would have made sense. Kindness had nowhere to land. The officer gestured to the wall again, and this time, the women saw it more fully. The faded painted lines, the shoe scuffs, the wooden backboard patched where someone had split it with a hard throw. The bullet marks were actually indentations from ricocheting balls and weathered brick fractures. The stains weren't blood. They were rain streaks. The truth was humiliating not because it accused them, but because it exposed how wrong their fear had been allowed to become. No officer back in Germany had ever said, "You may live." No instructor had ever said, "The enemy is still human." In the Reich's worldview, such a moment could not exist. Yet here it was. Reality is the most devastating rebuttal to propaganda because it doesn't argue, it simply contradicts by existing. But one woman broke first. Not with screams. Not with hysteria. With collapse. She stepped back from the line, knees folding, body shaking, hands covering her face as if shielding herself from a truth she wasn't ready to see. She sobbed harder than she had since her capture. Not from danger, but from disbelief. Because once the idea we might not die became real, its shadow arrived behind it. Then why did they make us believe we would? The crack widened. This wasn't a courtyard anymore. It was a reckoning. The officer called for medics, and 2 Americans rushed forward. Toward her, not against her. Kneeling, steadying her, speaking gently, offering water. The sight stunned the line more than gunfire would have. The enemy was propping her up instead of watching her fall. That image branded itself onto Anna's eyes like a wound stitched backward into healing. Something irreversible had begun. And the most frightening part was this. They were not prepared for mercy. The officer didn't raise his voice, didn't bark commands, didn't punish the girl for collapsing. He waited. Patience, that alone was enough to feel unreal. The women had been trained to expect judgment, not breathing room. Room was mercy. Mercy was foreign. Anna's lungs still hadn't caught up with reality. Her fear didn't know where to go now. It had no target, no justification left except its own momentum. When terror has nowhere left to land, it turns inward. Another woman near the end of the line swallowed hard and asked, voice barely audible, "Are they mocking us?" Because that was the only explanation that let fear keep its throne. They must be pretending. They must be performing. Cruelty postponed feels easier to believe than cruelty erased. No one answered because no one knew what to believe anymore. The officer resumed speaking after the medic finished checking the collapsed girl. You will be given barrack space, clean bedding, daily rations, medical treatment if required. Then he paused, not dramatically, but with a kindness that unsettled them more than shouting would have, and added, "You are prisoners, not targets." That distinction cracked something larger than fear. Prisoners may be confined, but they are still considered human. And for the first time since their capture, some of the women lifted their eyes not in dread, but in conflicted disbelief. Anna found her gaze drifting again to the hoop, the absurd, ordinary symbol of leisure that did not belong in her nightmare. She had never played basketball in her life. She barely knew the rules. But at that moment, that hoop became something far more than a game fixture. It became a contradiction she couldn't unsee. Enemies don't build courts. Monsters don't schedule recreation. But people do. Slowly, painfully, fear gave way to a colder, sharper feeling. Shame. Shame that she had believed without questioning. Shame that she had feared men who, so far, had shown nothing like the cruelty she expected. Shame that she had been taught the world was smaller and darker than it really was. The Reich had made the world feel like a siege. The courtyard made it feel like a mirror. Then came the moment that changed everything further. One of the guards, young, maybe 23, stepped away from his post and fetched a canteen. He didn't hand it to another American to pass forward. He brought it himself to the collapsed girl, placed it carefully into her shaking hands, and waited while she steadied her grip. No disgust, no insult, no hesitation. It was the smallest gesture and the most devastating, because kindness leaves no place for the myth to hide. The rest of the women stared, frozen between two realities: the world they were taught to expect, and the world unfolding in front of them. Anna's throat tightened, not from fear this time, but from an emotion she could not yet name. Something twisting between relief and grief, as if part of her past had just been declared counterfeit by a truth she couldn't unhear. This wasn't an execution. This was the beginning of an awakening she had never asked for, but could no longer escape. The courtyard, the hoops, the calm voices. It wasn't lenience. It was proof. And proof is what finally threatens indoctrination. Not argument, not debate, just proof. They were not about to die. They were about to be reintroduced to reality. And the most painful part of awakening is not opening your eyes. It is realizing how long they were closed. The officer waved for them to follow him toward processing. Not a march to death, but a walk toward something far more complicated. Life after lies. The walk from the courtyard to the barracks should have been simple. A short stretch of gravel and timber corridors, but for the women, it felt like stepping across a fault line in their own identities. Every footstep carried a new question. If the enemy was not a monster, then who were they in this story now? Victims? Prisoners? Witnesses? Or something in? It took less than 48 hours for the women to understand. The Americans weren't merely allowing them dignity, they were using it. Not as softness, not as sentiment, as strategy. Humanizing the enemy weakens fanaticism faster than punishment ever could. Punishment hardens belief. Mercy melts it. Where brutality creates martyrs, dignity creates mirrors. And a mirror is deadly to propaganda because it forces the believer to look at themselves. The U.S. officers knew this. This was not improvisation. This was doctrine. You cannot rebuild a future out of conquered bodies, but you can rebuild one out of unshackled minds. To soldiers trained for years to expect savagery, the smallest gesture of humanity carried the emotional force of artillery. It struck from the inside, not the outside. That afternoon, a medic returned for routine health checks. He spoke gently, asked questions without judgment, recorded notes like they mattered. When he finished, he didn't say, "Next." He said in German, "Please rest. You're safe now." Safe. The word didn't feel real. Anna stared at him, momentarily unable to nod or blink. Safe was not something she had planned to be again. Safe was not an outcome the Reich had prepared them for. Survival was not supposed to be gentle. He stood, moved to the next bunk, and kept going, as if what he had said were the most natural thing in the world. But for Anna, it was the emotional equivalent of stepping into sunlight after living underground. Safety was a concept she had been trained to distrust. Now she had to feel it. That shift from fear to bewildered relief was the softest kind of psychological disarmament, and the most effective. Hours later, as evening drew in and the courtyard emptied of noise, a guard opened the barracks door with a small stack of linen and set it beside the nearest bed. "Fresh if you need," he said, then left, no lecture, no threat. Marta whispered, voice small and shaking, "Why help us? After everything." Anna didn't answer because no answer she knew fit this reality. Indoctrination teaches recognition of cruelty, not recognition of grace. Grace is harder to survive than fear because it demands self-reflection rather than self-defense. Across the room, another young woman began to cry quietly. Not from pain, but from something she had never expected to feel while wearing German uniform colors. Relief. Not triumph. Not vindication. Just relief. The humiliation was not in being defeated. The humiliation was in discovering the enemy had never been the monster she'd been told, which meant the real violence had always been the lie. And here was the genius of Allied policy. They didn't need to humiliate captured auxiliaries. They simply had to let the truth stand beside them long enough for indoctrination to suffocate itself. This was not mercy as kindness. This was mercy as moral leverage. Show them a world better than the one that shaped them, and their old world collapses by comparison. The officers didn't have to lecture them. Reality itself was the lecture. That night, when lights were dimmed and quiet settled over the barracks, Anna lay awake staring at the bunk frame above her. Not from fear, but from a dawning grief she did not yet know how to name. She had been prepared to die bravely. She had not been prepared to live differently, because life after truth is heavier than death before it. And as silence spread through the sleeping quarters, a final question rose inside her. Not in panic, but in painful clarity. If the Americans were never the monsters, then who forged the monsters in our minds? Doubt is not the end of loyalty. It is the end of its illusion. And in that moment, Anna was no longer a prisoner of war. She was a prisoner of awakening, and awakening has no guard, no gate, no turning back. The Americans hadn't broken them. They had opened them. Night in the barracks did not bring rest. Not the kind they had expected. There were no nightmares of Allied cruelty. Instead there were the far more painful ghosts of memory. The Reich had taken their fear and built an identity out of it. Now that fear was cracking, the identity built upon it had nowhere to stand. They weren't just learning new truths. They were having to unlearn themselves. The morning after the courtyard incident, processing continued. Names taken, injuries logged, duties assigned. None of it violent, none of it degrading. Just administration. Just order. Just civilization. That was the wound. Civilization in enemy hands. Kindness from the beasts. Humanity from the side they had been trained to call inhuman. No one told them to abandon loyalty. No one scolded them, interrogated them, or tried to rewrite their beliefs through force. The Allies did not break their minds. They simply refused to match the nightmare built about them. Truth did the rest. During midday break, Anna watched a scene through the open doorway. 2 American soldiers helping another prisoner, an elderly German man, adjust his bandage. Their voices were calm, almost warm. No humiliation. No vengeance. The Reich had promised hell. Reality kept delivering decency. A realization dawned slowly inside her. Painful as a bruise pressed by truth. We were not afraid of the enemy. We were afraid of losing the story that justified the war. If the enemy was human, then so was accountability. If the enemy was merciful, then what excuse remained? One auxiliary in the corner clenched her fists and muttered bitterly, "They're only acting this way to break us." But the conviction behind her words was thin, fragile, like a wall with cracks running from ceiling to floor. Anna finally whispered back, "What if it's not an act?" The girl fell silent. Not because she agreed, but because she had no weapon left to fight the question. What if it wasn't an act? What if the world was never the size they'd been told? What if mercy was strength, not weakness? That question doesn't topple belief instantly. It rots it from the roots. By evening, the emotional shift was visible. Shoulders no longer locked rigid in defensive posture, breaths slightly less shallow, eyes lifting instead of shrinking. Not hope, not yet, but relenting. The first loosening of an inner fist. What was dawning wasn't gratitude, not yet, but recognition. You cannot indoctrinate someone into compassion, but you can awaken them into it. An awakening leaves a deeper mark than defeat. The women had not surrendered when they laid down their uniforms. They were only now, slowly, painfully, surrendering the worldview that forged those uniforms around them. The war outside was over, but the war inside them had only just begun. A war of mirrors, a war of memory, a war of truth against the fear that had once passed for patriotism. The Reich had ruled them through terror. The Americans were undoing that rule through dignity. Mercy wasn't an accident. It was demolition from the inside out. Years later, when some of these women were interviewed for post-war reports, their voices carried the same stunned softness when describing that courtyard day. Not because it was the moment they almost died, but because it was the moment they realized their worldview had. A firing squad would have ended their lives, but a basketball hoop ended their illusions. What broke them was not American power, but American restraint. You cannot hate a man who hands you water when you are shaking. You cannot demonize someone who kneels so you don't fall. You cannot cling to propaganda when reality contradicts it to your face. The Reich had promised them honor in death. But it was the enemy who offered them dignity in life. Some of those women later returned home carrying quiet shame, not for losing the war, but for finally understanding how small their world had been allowed to remain. They lived with a strange burden. Their first taste of peace had come not from victory, but from being treated as human by those they were taught to fear. That courtyard did not rewrite history. It rewired perspective. And that is the legacy that mattered. In their memories, the moment still stands like a scar crossed with a lantern's glow. A wall they thought would kill them became the first thing that showed them the truth. Not every POW was brutalized. Not every enemy was cruel. Not every indoctrinated mind stayed chained. Sometimes the most powerful battlefield isn't fought with bullets or borders, but with unexpected humanity. And the Americans didn't just win that day. They disproved the war inside their prisoners. Mercy was not the opposite of war. Mercy was the final blow against the lie that justified it. When history is told through battles, mercy is overlooked. But when history is told through people, mercy becomes the moment the war truly ends. Not with surrender on paper, but surrender of fear. The execution wall didn't mark their death. It marked their opening. And no propaganda machine on earth could close it again. Wars are won on maps, but humanity is won in moments like this. Quiet, unrecorded, hidden behind brick walls and unraveling fear. If you want more forgotten turning points where mercy became the sharpest edge in history, stay with us. The next story begins where this one leaves off.